Good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Thomas, and I would love to welcome you to Science on Tap Online. We're so glad you're all here this evening. Tonight, we are going to be talking about beloved beasts fighting for life in an age of extinction with author and science journalist Michelle Nijhuis. And Michelle is local here to the Pacific Northwest. She is in White Salmon, so just up the gorge from Portland. And she's got a background in biology and specializes in writing about conservation and global change. You may have seen some of her work in Scientific American, the Smithsonian Magazine, the New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, or National Geographic. And she has also written about how to write about science and is the co-editor of The Science Writer's Handbook, Everything You Need to Know to Pitch, Publish, and Prosper in the Digital Age. She's also currently a project editor at The Atlantic for a series called Life Up Close, and it looks fabulous, and we will be putting a link to that in the chat. So take a look at that as well. This book, Beloved Beast, just came out in March of this year, and we're excited to have her here to talk about it. And if you go to our, let me get my slide to go. If you go to our partner, Broadway Books, they're a fabulous local bookstore here in Portland, Oregon. They are offering a 15% discount off of this book. And if you order through May 6th, use the code STBeasts 15 and they will ship that out to you, or if you're Portland, you can come and go pick it up. But I encourage you to do that, and we'll put that link in the chat as well. So just a few things about Science on Tap for those of you who haven't been to one of our events before. We are a science lecture series based here in Portland, Oregon and Vancouver, Washington. We've been running for, 7 or 8 years or so, and we've obviously been doing events online for the last year, and we have done more than 30 since the pandemic started. And if you want to see any of those events, I encourage you to check out our YouTube page, which is youtube.com/scienceontap ORWA, and the ORWA is for Oregon and Washington. And you can see a bunch of our previous events there. And you can also listen to many of our podcast episodes. We have a podcast called A Scientist Walks Into a Bar. So check out our YouTube channel. Also, just want to give a quick thank you to these special Patreon folks in particular. These folks have been supporting us for an entire year. They joined in April of last year when we first started, and we couldn't be doing this without you. So thank you to all of our special Patreon supporters. And if you are interested in joining us on Patreon, we will put that link in the chat, and we'll also have that at the end as well. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slide and welcome our speaker of the evening, Michelle Nijhuis. Welcome.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks for having me. So let's see. Let me share my screen here. And I think we're ready to go. First of all, thanks so much for being here. I am a big fan of Science on Tap. I've attended many times at the Alberta Rose. I look forward to doing so again. And I'm really grateful to the Science on Tap team for keeping these talks going during the pandemic. I can only imagine how much work that took. And I really appreciate all of you joining tonight. It was fun to see the zip codes and the place names scroll by. I think I saw Alaska, a couple of Baltimore's, Tucson, and a couple of other far-flung place names. So welcome to the Pacific Northwest, at least virtually. I hope you have a beverage like I do and are ready for some stories. I want to talk tonight about a question that I get all the time as someone who thinks and writes about conservation. And it goes something like this. Do I have any hope? People put it different ways, but that's most often what they want to know. And my talk tonight is really an effort to answer that question more fully than I usually can, because usually I can only say yes, or maybe yes, but I'm not sure it's the kind of hope you're thinking of. So in order to more fully answer that question tonight, I'll tell you a few stories from my book and tell you what they have meant to me and what I hope they will mean to you. And then I hope we'll have plenty of time for some questions and discussion about hope and other things. Before I tell you some stories from the book, let me tell you a little bit about how the book got started, and by way of doing that, tell you a little bit about me. This is a picture of me from 1996. You can tell it's 1996 because not only do I no longer look that way, but I am holding that yellow stick I'm holding is a GPS antenna. And at this time, I was just out of college. I had a undergraduate degree in biology. I was making a living moving around the desert Southwest as a field assistant on wildlife research projects. And I think what I was doing with the GPS unit at that time was recording the exact locations of our study plot so that I could find it the following year. But as I'm sure you realize, anyone doing that today could do it much more easily with much less effort and probably more accurate with the phone in their pocket. So technology has changed just a little bit in the last 25 years. These jobs were so much fun. They took me to amazing landscapes and up close with really incredible animals. But the deepest impression that they made on me came from the fact that they brought me up close with some of the really passionate, even violent debates over endangered species that were taking place at the time in the West and are still unfolding all around the world, of course. Many of you will know the Bundy Brothers or be familiar with the names of the Bundy Brothers from the 2016 armed takeover of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge in Southern Oregon. Clive and Bundy, their father, first started getting national press back in 1994 and 95 when I was working in Southern Utah on desert tortoises. He was really torqued up about what protections for the desert tortoise would do for his grazing privileges, and he made a big stink, and that it was started a long series of confrontations with the federal BLM officials that actually culminated in some ways with the Capitol insurrection in January. So I was quite struck by these controversies, mostly because I was just struck by the profundity of the questions that people were talking about in coffee shops and in public meetings. They weren't just arguing about, which road should we close or which housing development should we curtail. They were arguing about whose responsibility is the species? Why does it matter? Should we even protect it? And I had this, as someone interested in conservation, I had this idea, okay, these questions have been, people before me have thought about these questions and come up with some answers, but I think also, like most conservationists, I didn't have a very strong sense of the history of the movement. I knew some famous names, but I didn't have a sense of it as an intellectual tradition that had developed over time. So these jobs and the situations they brought me into caused me many moments of astonishment and wondering. And 25 years later, I wrote a book. That's the short version. What happened in the parentheses and the ellipses is that I became a journalist. I continued to think and write about conservation as well as many other issues, including climate change. And I continue to be struck by the fact that in many situations where endangered and threatened species or any kind of species were involved, the same questions were coming up, the same arguments were happening, and there was really no agreement, no building on these arguments, no sense of progress. And I began to think, I remained interested in conservation history and what people had said about these questions in the past. And I began to think that it might be useful to try to piece the story of conservation together. I couldn't hope to tell the whole history, but to represent it in a way that would fit into a reasonably sized book and try to put those ideas together so that we could start to understand the progression of those ideas since the beginning of the modern conservation movement. But But the more immediate motivation for me for writing the book was really a frustration with the way that journalists, including myself, cover conservation. This is a completely unscientific selection of headlines from the previous month or so. These will, if not in the specifics, they will at least be familiar to you in the form. We as journalists are so, of course, we have to include drama in our stories because as much as we might like them to be required reading, they are not required reading. We have to make them interesting to read. We need some drama, but when we write about conservation, we always, default 9 times out of 10, we default to the drama of extinction, which is, of course, very dramatic. And I'm not at all saying that these are not important stories. It's just that I think when we always write about, when this is the form our stories take all the time, readers get numb to them. And also, we are not writing about the whole process of conservation. Like what happens, what are the efforts that happened and what are the efforts that didn't happen on this creature's path to near extinction. So we if we only are reporting on species when they're about to go extinct, we are not doing that much to protect life on Earth or to inspire others to protect life on Earth. So the book, in a sense, was a way for me to try to look deeper at the story of conservation, to try to find other ways to tell stories about what was working in conservation, what wasn't, and what might be done better in the future. Because if there's one thing I've learned about conservation from reading the history of conservation and reporting on conservation for a long time, it's that it's about much more than preventing extinction. It is about protecting relationships. It's about protecting relationships among species and habitats, and between humans and other species. It's presented to the public often as being about preventing extinction, but I think conservationists know, even if they don't include it in their ad campaigns, they know it's about protecting these relationships and protecting species in abundance so that they can maintain these relationships for the long term. That said, the modern conservation movement did get its start because people in North America and Europe realized that humans could drive species extinct, which is, one of my early realizations in researching this book is that extinction, the fact that humans themselves could cause a species to go extinct, that is a pretty new idea in the grand scheme of things. People have been driving species extinct for millennia. As soon as prehistoric humans started moving around the Pacific, they were driving bird species extinct because they brought along small predators that the birds weren't used to. And the small predators, the rats and cats, made quick work of the birds. And then when European sailors and colonists reached the Indian and Pacific Oceans, those extinctions accelerated. People were aware of these in North America and Europe, but they still hung on more or less to this idea that species were these unchanging categories that had been created by God. They neither appeared nor disappeared, and they didn't change over time. And it wasn't until the very beginning of the 1800s that scientists actually did show, yes, extinction has happened. There were kinds of animals that existed on the earth before humans, and they are no longer here. Look at these bones. But it wasn't until about 50 years after that, when Darwin came out with his book on the origin of species, in which he not only showed that species did change over time through the process of natural selection, but also made a kind of quiet mention of the fact that humans did have the capability of driving species extinct. It wasn't until then that people in North America and Europe really started to come to grips with the fact that, we are in some ways, we are less important than we think. We're not the special species. We're part of, we are a product of evolution like everybody else. But we're also more powerful than we think. We can drive a species extinct. And some people were so taken with this idea, or so fascinated with this idea, that they started to look back at species that had been driven extinct in the past and had been gone for so long that people actually wondered if they had existed at all. Like the dodo which had been extinct at that point for about 200 years. But Lewis Carroll, among other people, was so fascinated by the fact that sailors had arrived on the island of Mauritius, brought along small predators that had probably driven the bird extinct, that he turned himself into a dodo, and his alter ego in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was a giant talking dodo. And ever since Alice, we have considered the dodo to be a symbol of extinction. So people did, at this point, in 1865 or so, did understand that humans could drive species extinct. They still were struggling with the idea that humans could drive a species that was really physically large and abundant extinct, but they had to admit that that was possible later in the century, of course, with the example of the plains bison in North America. And the plains bison was, as many of you know, was super abundant, not just in the Great Plains, but beyond, in both directions. We are, at least I am in, I'm not sure if they've made it all the way to the coast, but they did make it all the way to where I live. Most of us in North America live in former bison territory. But they were under such enormous pressure from commercial hunting for hides, mostly, that by the end of the century, there were very few bison left. And people had to admit that even though this seemed impossible, they were about to go extinct. And most people entered another kind of denial at this point. They said things like, well, there were editorials to this effect saying, well, this is very sad. The bison looks like it's about to shuffle off the stage, but maybe this is the price of progress. Maybe the bison had to go in order for people to thrive on the Great Plains. And it took people like William Temple Hornaday, this fellow in the spiffy suit with a stick in the front, to stand up and say, look, that it's not inevitable and it can be avoided. And we really have an obligation to make sure it doesn't happen. And William Hornaday ironically, he was a trophy hunter. He was a taxidermist. He did some things. He had a genuine admiration and respect for the buffalo. He did some things that may or may not have been all that helpful to the buffalo. But one thing that he did that we know was very helpful was that when he became director of the Bronx Zoo, he raised a herd of buffalo in the Bronx. And after a few years of trial and error, he had a pretty healthy herd of bison in the Bronx. And there are bison at the Bronx Zoo even today. And in 1907, he put a part of this herd on the train, sent it out to Oklahoma, and the animals were let loose, and they did very well. They multiplied, and the descendants of that herd were used to seed the herds that are now, the large herds that are now on public land today. In fact, they're still sometimes called the Hornaday Herds. And I mean, Hornaday was not the only savior of the bison. He had many supporters, and there were other people doing different work, but had he not done this, we might well not have the relatively healthy population of bison that we have on the plains today, because when these bison were put on the train and went to Oklahoma, the bison was effectively extinct. So Hornaday was an extremely complicated man. He was fascinating, if exhausting and occasionally depressing to learn about. As I write in my book, that early conservation history especially is full of people who did the right things for the wrong reasons. And Hornaday is a textbook example of that, as was his close friend, Teddy Roosevelt, pictured here in his full mountain man kit. I think Teddy Roosevelt was in his late 20s, and he was taking kind of a wilderness year off from politics. He had suffered a political defeat, and he went to live for a year in South Dakota. This picture that was taken in New York. So he put on the costume for the photo. And as you can see here, Roosevelt, along with Hornaday and many of their supporters, were really enamored with this idea of the frontier being a place where they could test and strengthen their masculinity. And to them, the bison was a way of was part of an effort to protect white masculinity, which was widely thought to be under threat at the time from industrialization. Young white men were thought to be kind of wilting away in offices and a bit pallid and in need of a good couple of weeks to get their blood pumping on the frontier, preferably chasing after a healthy herd of buffalo. So their motivations were all wrapped up with these ideas about white masculinity, their ideas about nationalism. They saw bison as a powerful symbol of the strength of America, this, still young and growing nation. And they also, most perniciously, Hornaday especially, did not acknowledge the people who were most devastated by the decline of the bison, who were, of course, the tribes and First Nations of the North American plains. And in fact, there was a lot of evidence, as there is today, that white market hunters were primarily responsible for the decline of the bison, but Hornaday didn't want anything to do with that and continued to insist that, in fact, Native Americans had been primarily responsible for the decline of the bison. So Hornaday was, his life was full of contradictions and ironies, but what I probably love best about his story is the happy irony that has followed it, which is that today, there is, I think, one of the most exciting things happening in conservation anywhere is that there is a tribally led continent-wide effort to restore the bison more fully to the plains. So Hornaday ecology was very young at the time. No one thought about reintroducing a species. He was doing something that was totally new. And he basically just treated the bison like cows, took them out to Oklahoma, plunked them on the plains, hoped that they would do okay. And of course, now with, thanks to ecology and conservation biology, we have a much stronger sense of the role that bison played as a keystone species on the prairie, their relationship with other species, and how the prairie has changed in their absence. So these tribally led conservation efforts are using animals from these Hornaday herds to establish their own herds on tribal land. They are working to allow these herds to move more freely because all the large herds are still enclosed. But they're hoping in the future to have some of these herds connected, moving more freely, recapturing some of their former migration patterns around the continent. And by doing so, we're probably never going to get back to the moving multitudes that Lewis and Clark described, but we might have a lot more bison, and we might have a lot more we might have a lot stronger relationship, a much stronger relationship between bison and the ecosystem that they are so central to. So at about the same time that Hornaday was working on the bison, there was a parallel movement to protect birds. And there were a couple of pretty large threats to different species of birds at this time in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The first and perhaps most direct threat was actually from bird lovers and scientists who loved birds because there were not, at that time, there were not cheap binoculars available or other cheap optics. And the way to get a good look at a bird that you were fascinated by was to shoot it. And a lot of naturalists and scientists, this is still done today on a very limited basis. Scientists will take a few birds, they'll apply for a permit to do this, and they'll take a few birds for DNA analysis or closer study. But naturalists at that time really didn't think very much of just shooting birds by the dozen or even the hundreds, taking eggs for collection. And over time, each of them thought, well, I'll just take one more. And over time, this actually started to have a pretty significant effect on bird populations. And there are stories of some of these early ornithologists writing in their journal about Frank Chapman, who was pretty powerful in the early Sierra Club, writes about chasing after the Carolina parakeet, which he knew was very rare at the time, and writing in his journal, oh, well, I took 6 today. I'm not going to take any more because I don't want to be the person who drives this bird extinct. And then the next day, he takes 2 more and he says that's going to be the end. And it's funny, but also horrifying. And the Carolina parakeet, not because of Frank Chapman, but because of Frank Chapman and others, is unfortunately extinct today. So what changed that was the advent of cheap binoculars, and also people like Florence Marion Bailey, who was when she was just a young college graduate, she graduated from Smith College, she wrote a book called Birds Through an Opera Glass, which is considered the first popular birding guide anywhere. And it taught people, both naturalists and people who had never thought about looking closely at birds before, that they could go out on the weekend with their opera glasses, as they were called at the time, and they could get a really close look at these incredible birds. And that it became a really popular pastime. It not only, opera glasses not only allowed naturalists and scientists to stop shooting so many birds, but it also created all this popular support for conserving birds. And it really jump-started the Audubon Society movement at that time. And this is a little bit of a side note, but Florence Marion Bailey was quite well known in her time, but she went on to write many other books, but she was not memorialized in the New York Times when she died. And just a couple of years ago, she became part of the Overlooked No More series, which is an effort to write obituaries for people who were important, but that the New York Times overlooked at the time of their death. And so she finally got a real full testament to her work and to her importance in the early conservation movement. So the other threat to birds, the larger threat probably, were these fantastic hats. And they, of course, feathers have been used for decoration for millennia, but there have been recurrent fads for feathered fashions, especially hats. And the fashion for feathered hats at the end of the 19th century was especially harmful to birds, in part because fashion was democratizing at the time. So middle-class women could look at a mail order catalog and order knockoffs of designer fashions, which was, in many ways terrific, but it increased the demand for these feathered fashions so much that the plume trade, what was called the plume trade, just boomed. And hunters were killing birds so that people could, could wear these wild hats. And like most fads, the fashion sort of escalated, so that what started out as a couple feathers on a hat turned into entire birds, as you can see here, or entire wings. There's that kind of exclamation point effect on at least on my right. And then the last one, where there's this kind of wicker laundry basket situation going on with these giant feathers coming out of it. And these were, of course, really damaging to bird populations, because not only did birds get killed, but their chicks were orphaned. And this photo is part of a famous series of photographs that was published and actually raised a lot of awareness about what was happening to birds, because this photographer in Australia documented the killing of a mother egret and then the slow, painful starvation of her poor chicks. So, and then here's another picture of hummingbirds for sale in London. 2 cents each, even adjusting for inflation. These beautiful birds were going pretty cheap, and demand increased to the point that a rough estimate is that 5 million birds were killed worldwide each year to supply the feather trade. So the somewhat predictable reaction, especially by male conservationists, was to blame the wearers of the hat or of the hats. And there were lots of cartoons at the time like this, like women wearing fancy hats and using a gun, or strangling birds, or looking evil surrounded by dead birds. And the attitude of, our friend William Hornaday was pretty typical of conservationists of his time. He published this this essay, kind of like rant, on the cover of the women's section of the New York Times. No one told him that this was perhaps not the best PR strategy to scold the people he wanted to influence. But this was a long rant about how horrible women's fashion was for birds, and how they should stop doing it. And I love Virginia Woolf's response to all this, because the outrage was on both sides of the Atlantic, and she responded to a similar argument by male conservationists in the UK by saying, and I'm paraphrasing her here, but she says something like, "Look, I have no sympathy for the society woman who thinks that a lemon-colored egret is the perfect addition to her evening wear, but let's remember the birds are killed by men, starved by men, and tortured by men with their own hands." So she might have also said that women were at the forefront of the fight against the plume trade, and they fought for decades within the Audubon Society and in other organizations, many of them using activist skills that they had gained in the suffrage movement. Interestingly, there's a really strong connection between those two movements, where women transferred their training from that very successful fight to get the right to vote and brought great strength to the conservation movement. And in 1918, they won very decisively when Congress passed the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which really killed the plume trade in North America. And then 3 years later, in 1921, the UK passed it finally, after much similar activism in the UK, passed a ban on the importation of plumage, and similar laws were passed around Europe. So the plume trade was never the same. And volunteer bird watchers in the years that followed went to Florida and elsewhere, where so many birds had been killed for the plume trade, and they were able to see populations of egrets and other very fancy feathered birds go up almost immediately, because of course the birds were no longer being killed and orphaned, so their populations just went up and up and up. So it was a very decisive victory, and one that had an almost immediate positive effect for bird populations. So, but the job wasn't done, because as you saw in the last slide, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act protected these birds that had been hunted for plumage for hats, but it didn't protect birds of prey like eagles and hawks. And the Audubon Society, actually, sportsmen like William Hornaday kind of considered eagles and hawks to be pests. Even though the bald eagle was our national bird, they thought, well, these are scavengers. These are birds you don't really want to invite to a party. They're kind of competition for us, because we like to hunt game birds and they like to hunt them too. And so they weren't doing all that much. They were kind of picking and choosing the species they wanted to protect. They weren't doing all that much on behalf of hawks and eagles. And one person who felt differently was Rosalie Edge, who was born into a wealthy Manhattan family and was active in the suffrage movement. And then in her 40s, her marriage kind of suddenly broke up, and she was recovering from this personal loss and shock, and she turned to bird watching for solace. And she lived on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and she started birding, as many people do, in Central Park, and she got to know the birders who frequented the park. And as she gained their trust, as kind of a shy, insular group, and as she gained their trust, they told her, you wouldn't believe it, but the Audubon Society is really not doing that much for birds of prey. So she, as was her wont, put on her elegant dress, marched from her brownstone on the Upper East Side across the park and into the 1929 annual meeting of the National Association of Audubon Societies, which was taking place at the Museum of Natural History. And she gave the leadership of the Audubon Society a huge piece of her mind, saying, look, you have to protect all species. Conservation shouldn't be about, she had a very prescient understanding of ecology, and she said, conservation should not be about just protecting the species we like. It should be about protecting all species, because there's something bigger than us going on here. And there was actually among the membership quite a bit of support for this position. So she raised such a uproar that the leaders of the Audubon Society, somewhat after a while, somewhat sheepishly had to back down and embrace protection for all species. But eagles and hawks were still not protected by law. And so not long after that, Rosalie Edge heard about this ridgetop in Pennsylvania, where recreational hunters would go each weekend during the fall and shoot migrating hawks that came overhead. The topography and the wind currents of over the ridgetop were such that there was just a lot of hawks and eagles were funneled through there. So it was very easy for them to pick off dozens of hawks and eagles at a time. And this was just, again, because they thought they were sport or kind of disposable birds. This is something they just did for fun, and perhaps out of a little bit of concern for their chickens or their game birds. Rosalie Edge was, of course, horrified by this, and she rented and then bought the ridgetop and turned it into Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, which still exists today. One of the most important things that she did when she founded Hawk Mountain Sanctuary was to turn to the fellow in the white hat here, Maurice Brown, who was the caretaker of the sanctuary for many years, and say, I think it'd be a good idea for you to just watch the migration and take notes on the number and kind of species that we see here. I think that might be useful at some point. And he duly did, and it was the first record of its time. There are now many others, but it is now the longest record of its time. I think there are only a couple of interruptions when he was deployed during World War II. Other than that, it has been kept up. And you can go to Hawk Mountain today, especially during the migration. You can help with the raptor count or watch it being done. And I really recommend you go. It's quite an exhilarating experience to be up on these promontories where the hawks not only fly, very close overhead, but even below you, because they're just being pushed by these very strong wind currents over the ridge. And you almost feel like you're up there in the sky with them, because they're on every side of you, and flying at top speed to get to where they're going. And in 1945, so this was about a little more than 10 years after the founding of Hawk Mountain, Rachel Carson, who was a young Fish and Wildlife Service employee at the time, paid a visit to Hawk Mountain. She was very struck by it. She started to write about it. This is from an unpublished piece of writing that only surfaced after her death. And then 15 years later, when she was an established author, she wrote to Maurice Brown and said, I'm working on a book about DDT and its effect on wildlife. And I have heard that you have seen a drop in eagle numbers recently. Could you tell me something about that? And he wrote back and said, Dear Ms. Carson, yes, I have. And I know it's unusual because we've now been keeping records for 25 years. We know that nothing like this has happened in the last 25 years. And the numbers of young eagles have been going down very rapidly in the past few years. And in fact, this year we had no eagles at all. And that piece of data, Rachel Carson ended up describing it as very significant in her book, Silent Spring, which made a powerful case against DDT. And I just am always struck when I think back about the series of events, because had Rosalie Edge not started Hawk Mountain Sanctuary, Rachel Carson would not have had that data. And she was making a very difficult case. We now know from laboratory experiments that DDT was thinning the eggshells of eagles and other birds, and making it all but impossible for them to reproduce. But she didn't know that at the time. And so she was basically having to build a case like a lawyer, like collect case study after case study and say, look, there's got to be a common thread here. And the only possible common thread is DDT. And, had she not had that very persuasive piece of evidence from Maurice Brown, Silent Spring might have been a much weaker case. And as it was, it took about 10 years after it was published to ban DDT, as popular as Silent Spring was. And, we might be living in a very different world today had it not been for Rosalie Edge, Maurice Brown, and then the work of Rachel Carson that spread that made the work that had been done at Hawk Mountain into a national story. So there's one more person I want to talk about before I wrap up, because her story also gives me the kind of hope that I drew from my work on conservation history. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the name Eleanor Ostrom, but you're probably familiar with the expression, the tragedy of the commons. And the tragedy of the commons it's not really a theory, it was more of an idea proposed in 1968 by an ecologist named Garrett Hardin in the Pages of Science, the journal Science. And he proposed that when humans have access to a shared resource, they will inevitably take as much of that resource as they possibly can until the resource is exhausted. And the only solution to what he called the tragedy of the commons is to either radically privatize the resource or place it under total government control. And even as he was publishing this, and again, this was something I think that the idea of the tragedy of the commons has stuck in our minds as a very powerful metaphor because we can observe it all the time. You know, if you've been stuck in a traffic jam, you have experienced the tragedy of the commons. And Garrett Hardin was not drawing on any data. He was just making this observation like anyone else might from life experience. But Eleanor Ostrom, who was doing her PhD research at the time, you know, saw this proposal in the Pages of Science, and she said, well, I have data and I know that yes, the tragedy of the commons happens, but it's not inevitable. You know, she was working with water users around Los Angeles, and she had watched as they had worked out this messy but workable system of sharing this very very valuable, very contentious resource without resorting to government control or privatization. And so she devoted her career really to disproving the inevitability of the tragedy of the commons. She won the Nobel Prize in 2009. And she documented all kinds of systems throughout the world that people had developed and had sometimes been working for centuries, where they had successfully shared an important resource, whether it was water or forest or pasture or wildlife. And they had managed to do it without privatizing, without resorting to government control. And they had managed to preserve the resource at some sustainable level and also provide themselves with a livelihood. And she documented these systems and studied her work on what is now called commons research, tries to diagnose why successful systems work. What are the qualities that make them successful and make them last? And so her work, it's not, even though she was awarded the Nobel Prize, it's not as well known as it should be, even within the fields of political science and economics. It's certainly not well known in conservation. I often hear conservationists just talk casually about, the tragedy of the commons, and assuming that humans are really incapable of playing a constructive role in conservation unless forced to. And I find her work has inspired a movement within conservation of community. It's called community-led conservation. And I was able to go to Namibia and get to know a long-standing community-led conservation, a nationwide system at this point that has had huge successes. And I can talk about that a little later if people are interested, but it was quite an eye-opening experience for me as a conservationist from North America to see, wow, look, here are these people who have, very few resources, far fewer resources than most of the conservationists that I have reported on. And here they are gathering in their community conservancy, setting hunting quotas, arguing about the best way to ensure the long-term future of the species that they live alongside. And I think these systems, which are now being revived and restored and established according to the principles that Eleanor Ostrom uncovered, are really the future that I see for conservation, or one of the most promising directions for conservation to take, because parks and reserves are useful. They're going to continue to be useful. But what the conservation movement needs in order to accomplish conservation on a meaningful scale is to help people live within their ecosystems in a functional way. And I think community conservation, we in North America could learn a lot from successful community-led conservation efforts in other places, because they have reconnected people with their wildlife that they lost authority over during the days of colonization. They have reconnected people, given some power back to communities over wildlife, and reconnected people with a feeling of responsibility and tolerance for wildlife. And I think uncovered what I like to believe, I hope this is true, but I think if you gave people anywhere a truth serum and said, do you really want this species that you've lived alongside since childhood to go extinct? I think that most people would say no. They might be annoyed. They might be, annoyed by a species that is kind of troublesome. They might be annoyed by a government policy related to that species. But I think even as polarized as we are, I do not think that most people want to see another form of life that they know well go extinct. And that is clear from community-led conservation projects around the world. And I think, as I said, I think we have a lot to learn from those projects here in North America, and they could point the way out of some of our very deep-rooted conflicts over predators here in the West and elsewhere. So where's the hope? That was a long preamble to the answer to my question. Here are the things that I find hopeful about that have given me hope from the history of the conservation movement. It has, despite the way that journalists cover the conservation movement, despite the way the conservation movement advertises itself often in its calendar photos and so forth, it has expanded from single iconic species to protecting habitats and ecosystems. It's learned through conservation biology, which I talk a lot about in my book. It's learned a great deal about what species need for long-term survival. And it's also, thanks to Eleanor Ostrom, learning belatedly how to support humans to live sustainably within ecosystems and alongside other species. It's learning conservation always costs something in the short term, but I think community-led conservation is one way of helping to reduce those early costs and more equitably share the long-term benefits of conservation so that you can uncover that, I think, common desire not to see species go extinct, to protect healthy populations of species. Those systems help people get over their practical resistance to conservation, because of course people do want to feed their families, they want to make a living, and they don't want to be burdened with short-term costs, especially when they feel that other people aren't having to pay those costs. And it's also, and this is something else I talk a lot about in my book, it's reckoning with its history of racism and colonialism. I touched on this when I talked about William Hornaday, but it's these are threads that are deep in the conservation movement, deep and long, and I think there's a genuine effort to reckon with them and look, and not just pay lip service to, unfortunate language or appalling language that was used in the past, but to really look at how those attitudes affected conservation strategies and to change those strategies accordingly. And again, part of that is supporting community-led conservation efforts worldwide and in North America. We are fortunate, I think, to have a Indigenous Secretary of the Interior for the very first time in history who is very aware and has already spoken about the importance of these kinds of conservation efforts here and elsewhere. Another lesson that I find hopeful, or a reminder that I find hopeful, is that change takes time and the work of many hands. Just a few examples that I've already talked about. The bison restoration has unfolded over a century. Rachel Carson, again, it took 10 years after Silent Spring, as successful as it was, to ban DDT. And it took a grassroots activist who had very little experience and very little money, but a lot of stubbornness to get that done, to convince the Environmental Protection Agency to ban DDT. Rosalie Edge spoke up for birds of prey starting in 1929. The bald eagle was finally taken off the endangered species list in 2011. I know that's a success story because when I was growing up on the East Coast in the 70s and 80s, the only time I ever saw a bald eagle was on the back of a coin. And now in the gorge, I see them often, so often that I get excited, but my daughter just rolls her eyes and says, "Oh yeah, another one." So I know that it's a success because bald eagles are now boring. And then, I do worry about time. I do worry that we will have irretrievable losses before we get smart enough to start saving species in a way that we can scale up appropriately. But I think, like a lot of people who think about conservation and climate change, I was weirdly heartened as well as devastated by the events of early 2020. Even though we could point to a million problems and inequities with the global response to coronavirus, it was a dramatic illustration of how quickly humans can change their behavior on an enormous scale and in very radical ways. So for me, the hope I drew from this project, and that I hope people will draw from the book, is that the future is uncertain. There's such a narrative, I think, of apocalypse in our society right now, for understandable reasons. I mean, I remember looking out my window last summer when I was trapped in my house by the pandemic and by wildfire smoke and thinking this was really not looking good. But we don't know. A lot of conservationists of the past worked, during the Dust Bowl or during World War II or before World War II. And they had, I'm sure were very worried about the future. And, but they continued to do what they knew was right. And with uncertainty comes possibility. And I know from learning about the history of the conservation movement that we've learned a lot, made a lot of mistakes, but we have learned from them. And we have made progress, and we can apply those lessons now, even though there will be losses, there will be species that go extinct, but we have so much left. Despite the headlines, there are so many species that are still thriving and that we could protect. So the kind of hope I think that is most encouraging to me is really not what I would call hope, but what I would call resolve. It's the resolve to keep doing what you think is going to be helpful, even without the guarantee that you're going to get to witness the results. And when I do feel bad, when I am looking out the window at wildfire smoke plus a pandemic, I take refuge in an expression or in a line by Aldo Leopold, who was someone I talk about a lot in my book, but he was quite an optimistic person, but in a very grim mood one day, he wrote to a friend and said that the situation is hopeless, should not prevent us from doing our best. And I don't think the situation is hopeless, but I do hope that we can all continue to do our best. So thank you. And I really look forward to questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that overview. And we have a lot of questions from the audience, and I want to encourage the rest of you who are watching, if you haven't already submitted a question and you have one, please go ahead and put that in the Q&A or in the comments if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, and we can try and get to as many of those as we can. I want to start off with a question that is kind of fundamental to what your book is about. Mm-hmm. And had somebody, one of our viewers, say, extinctions have happened throughout time, and maybe there's an accelerated rate of extinctions since we humans have come along, but isn't that part of the natural flow of things? And it reminded me of climate change and the climate has warmed in the past, and why should we be worried about this now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. And in fact, there have been conservationists in the past. I'm thinking especially of there was a big argument within the conservation movement over the fate of the whooping crane, and there was a very thoughtful, passionate conservationist who argued that we should not breed whooping cranes in captivity, because he thought, well, a whooping crane that doesn't migrate is not a whooping crane in any real sense. And he said, I think maybe this species is on its way out. It's not going to be favored by evolution. Maybe we should, quote unquote, let it go. We obviously most people disagreed with that, and we do have a captive breeding project for whooping cranes, and we are, I think, fortunate to have the species with us today. But yeah, it's true, and it is similar to climate change in that, yes, the climate is always changing, species are always going extinct, but humans have vastly accelerated the rate of extinction. And I think what conservationists don't want is for that accelerated rate to continue and even accelerate further. Conservationists don't want untimely extinctions. Extinction is a natural process. We don't want to accelerate it.
I'm curious in terms of science communication, which is something that is near and dear to my heart and yours as well, obviously. But one of my pet peeves is how the word theory is misused in popular culture, in terms of, a theory is a very specific thing in science versus what it's used in common speech. And you talk about the phrase survival of the fittest being a specific thing, talking about the fittest for that ecological niche, and not that it's the biggest, baddest critter is going to survive because they're the fittest for that. And I'm just wondering, are there other terms that are being used? You talked about how some of the articles that are coming out today are, have a not a one-sided, but a very kind of dire feel to them. Are there terms or feelings or things that are being kind of misrepresented in a way that we should be aware of and maybe pay attention to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I thought that example of the survival of the fittest was so interesting because it was as someone who thinks about communication like you, it was an example of someone using the wrong word or a word that was the word that was just not precise enough for the situation. And there's letters you can read of Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a great friend of Darwin, saying, "Oh, this expression, the survival of the fittest, it's going to be misunderstood," and how right he was. um, so, yeah, I mean, there are many examples. I mentioned the tragedy of the commons that I think is understood to be a theory when it was really just sort of a hot take. A 1968 hot take about the state of the world, but because it was published in Science, it kind of gained this gravitas that it didn't quite merit, and has survived, I think, because it was a catchy phrase and because it was placed in a prestigious place. As far as ideas or words that get thrown around a lot, I won't keep dragging on my answer, but I will put in a plug for getting away from the use of nature and wilderness in imprecise ways. I made actually a conscious effort to not use those terms unless I defined them in my book, and I found it to be a really great exercise because it changed a little bit the way I saw my relationship as a human being with the rest of life. And I think that we can, by the words we choose, we can create divisions and separations that we don't necessarily believe are there, and they're just built into our language, and we you know um, we preserve them by continuing to use that language.
Can you talk a little bit about if there's a difference, or which one's better, an ecosystem versus a species-focused restoration efforts?
Yeah, good question. I mean, obviously, ecosystem function. I'm sorry, I'm losing my words. But speaking of language, but an ecosystem focused approach is better. But I am very sympathetic to the fact that species are not just easier for people to relate to, but the law, our entire legal system is built around the preservation of individual species. And so I am sympathetic to the fact that conservationists still have to talk about species and use the species concept strategically, both legally and emotionally to some extent. That said, I think that conservationists could do a much better job, and journalists could do a much better job of taking a risk with some stories that may be a little bit harder to get into, or a little bit harder to find the drama in for us as writers, or for conservation organizations as communicators, but really do contain amazing stories. And with a little patience and with a little creativity, we could start to tell stories about ecosystem level conservation that would be equally interesting and equally dramatic. And I mean, if I have another, I love bald eagles, but if I have another story illustrated by a picture of a bald eagle, I'm going to croak. So I think photo editors especially are in need of a lesson in ecosystem conservation and communicating in creative ways about the importance of ecosystems.
Can you talk a little bit more about science writing? Obviously, you talked in your book a lot about Silent Spring, and you've brought it up this evening, and a couple of people have asked about that. That book was very impactful on public policy, and what do you think about that happening now? Is that possible, or are things too spread out, or any thoughts about that?
That's a great question. I mean, it's a bit like 80s TV. I don't think I don't think anything produced today is going to have the audience that Silent Spring was able to command. But that's not to say that successors to Rachel Carson can't have an impact. And I did notice throughout my research on the book that many of the people I profiled, and I don't think this was just my own bias as a writer, but many of the people I profiled, in addition to being researchers or accomplished activists or what have you, were also very eloquent writers or communicators. They were great tellers of their own stories or other people's stories. Rachel Carson, Aldo Leopold. I mean, I had the chance to read some of Aldo Leopold's millions of letters that he wrote throughout his life, as well as his published work. And he was just such an eloquent wordsmith, and his work really holds up in a literary sense today. And then other writers like Julian Huxley and even William Hornaday was quite an entertaining writer for his time. So I think that science writing and science communication and of course now multimedia communication about science can and will make a difference despite the fragmentation of our audiences today.
I'm curious about natural history museums. I'm thinking of ones that have stuffed dodos, or I don't know that actually any of those exist anymore. But these animals that were.
Yeah.
Oh, do they? Okay.
Well, skeletons. Yeah.
Okay. They, there's these great collections of all these birds that all the conservationists shot back in the day, and I'm curious about that versus, I think it was E.O. Wilson you quoted in the book about you can't cherish something you don't know. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of the tension between those two kinds of things?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, it's a great question. Well, as I talked about, there used to be really I think excessive collecting by naturalists and nature enthusiasts. And I mean, some of those specimens are still in museums. And in fact, some of them have proved quite useful to science because we're able to do DNA analysis. It's pretty routine actually for people to discover new species in museum archives. So they have their uses. It was obviously too much. That kind of collection has been, drastically reined in since then. I have very mixed feelings, and maybe increasingly mixed feelings about zoos, even though I recognize that so many people, including myself, have childhood experiences from zoos that gave me a visceral sense of other species that I would, species that I didn't live anywhere near. It gave me a visceral sense of their being, their vitality. But I agree, as you say, I think there is a tension there, and there's a danger in, I think that zoos risk teaching people that conserving species in zoos is what conservation is all about, especially now that zoos are doing a lot of assisted reproduction work, a lot of advanced reproductive technology in order to save very endangered species. I think it's really important for zoos to continue, like journalists and like conservation organizations, they need to continue to tell the story of ecosystem preservation, that's the end goal, that it's not just to have two, northern white rhinos alive in a zoo, that the goal is to restore species to abundance, and that these reproductive technologies should be a very, very much a last resort, and not something that we're relying on to keep species alive. It's just too expensive.
I'd like to ask something about your presentation this evening and something that you cover in the book a lot, the bison, the scientific name, right?
Yeah.
But the success story of that, you said that the bison are critical to the health of the plains, and one of our attendees asked why.
Yeah,
Can you
good
talk about
question.
that?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. They, well, as they move around the prairie, they they eat, eat the grasses of the prairie. They poop out great habitat for insects and birds that were once common on the prairie that are no longer common on the prairie. And just the pressure of their grazing on the prairie grasses creates it stimulates the grass to green up more quickly. And so the absence of the bison, or the much lower population of the bison that we've had over the last 150 years, has actually shrunk the prairie ecosystem, along with all the other things that have shrunk the prairie ecosystem. But the absence of the bison has shrunk the prairie ecosystem to a great extent. And as I said, some of those species of insects and birds and other associated species that used to be plentiful when the bison were plentiful are no longer plentiful.
How did you choose the stories and the people that you focused on in your book?
Well, so this, I mean, telling the story of conservation was extremely daunting. Especially when I started out, I had to ignore a lot of people who were like, that's not going to be one book. That's going to be 6 books. And I said, no, I really, really, really want it to be one book. I want to try and represent the complexity of it in a book that people can, the people who may not be spending their careers in conservation will find interesting. And so the people I chose, some of them I knew just would be in there because they're so well known and people would want to know how they fit into the history of conservation, like Rachel Carson or Aldo Leopold or John Muir. He's not a main character in my book, but he does come up just because I think that's a name that people know and they want to kind of fit him in the pantheon, so to speak. But really, I wanted each major character to represent what I saw as a significant turning point in conservation. So, that William Hornaday represented this realization that physically large species could go extinct and that someone needed to stop them from going extinct. And then Rosalie Edge, who is the next chapter, this kind of star of the next chapter, represented the turn toward embracing conservation for all species, not just ones that we happen to find inspiring or cool. And so the chapters progress like that, with each person representing a major development in the conservation movement. And in that way, I hope to get the concepts across without having a cast of bazillions. I mean, there are many other people who make cameo appearances throughout, but by choosing a dozen people or so to represent the major turning points, I hope to make my task something that I could finish before I died.
Well, there are some very compelling stories in there. So if you, the audience, haven't already picked the book up, I recommend that you do. I have a couple more questions. Natasha was asking about community-led conservation efforts, specifically like in Namibia and Kenya. There's some successful programs there. Do you see those kinds of things here in the States? And kind of on top of that, are there any that our local Pacific Northwest audience can potentially get involved with?
So because a lot of the successful community-led conservation efforts are happening in communities where a lot of people are still subsistence hunters or farmers, and because there are many fewer of those in North America, the model doesn't exactly apply. But I think the idea of returning some level of conservation authority to local communities, which is not to say, I mean, we've had some nightmare scenarios where wolf management is returned to the states and then hundreds of wolves get shot. I mean, we're not there yet, but I think there are other ways that we could learn from the model of community-led conservation in the sense that sometimes, and I learned this in Norway, where there's a lot of deep-seated conflict over wolves. Sometimes when ranchers and farmers who are pretty opposed to predator, to the spread of predators in Norway, in rural Norway, sometimes when they participate in citizen science, when they say, okay, if you're taking a population survey, we can show you where the best places might be to put the cameras, and we'll go out and collect data from the cameras. When there's that kind of participation, that kind of exchange, there's not easy agreement, but there's at least a shared reality that people can agree on. They know that they're dealing with data that they both trust, and they can proceed from there. So I think those kinds of things might have a lot of application in the West, especially. And we have seen some of that over the years with, conservation groups working with farmers on predator-proof fencing, or shepherd dogs that are helpful at keeping wolves away from herds and that sort of thing. But I think philosophically, the conservation movement could learn, philosophically and practically, the conservation movement could learn a lot from those community-led conservation efforts. As far as things to support in the Pacific Northwest, there are some initiatives to return management of natural resources to tribes. Most recently, this is not exactly Northwest, but in Montana, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes just reclaimed management authority over the National Bison Range, which was taken away from the tribes 150 years ago. William Hornaday was involved in that, actually, and just in January, management authority was returned to the tribes. So those kinds of efforts are afoot. There's a lot of interest in them, and I don't know of any in the Pacific Northwest, but I feel optimistic that we will have many more to support in the coming years.
Well, and this is not exactly what the community-led programs are about, but I'm just going to put a plug in for keeping your cats indoors. So.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one predator that can be easily managed.
Indeed. I know we have some more questions, but we're running a little bit long on the Q&A, and I want to respect your time. So my final question that I have been asking all of our speakers recently is, why do you feel it's important for people to learn about science?
I think it is important to learn about science. Well, there are some obvious reasons to learn about science. It's important to be informed, but I think it's important to learn about science because, unlike I thought in high school, science is a process and it's always changing. It's an unfolding story. And I think, I thought in high school, maybe many of you felt the same way, that it was just a collection of facts. And it is so much more than that. And there are so many stories about humans and stories about other forms of life that are, as I said at the end of my presentation, we don't know how they're going to end or if they're going to end, and they're unfolding as we speak. So that's why I love learning about science.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being here, Michelle. And I encourage all of you to pick up the book. It's available on audiobook as well. And although if I'll put another plug in for checking out Broadway Books, our local or partner here in Portland. And thank you, Michelle, for being here, and I look forward to having you, meeting you in person at the Alberta Rose at some point in the future. So
likewise, thanks to everyone for coming. It was a pleasure, and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks. And I just have a few things I want to finish up with. I'm going to share my screen again and mention that, we have been doing these events for a year online now, and we think that bringing science to the community is really important. Obviously, Michelle's been talking about that as well. If you can spare a couple bucks, we would love it. You could join us on Patreon. I give out some things occasionally, and I can send you a pint glass and a few things like that. So please, if you're interested in helping support the program, you can make a one-time donation or join us on Patreon. Also, next month Oh, actually, let me back up just a second. Just want to say a quick thank you to our 128 Patreon supporters. This is a list of the wonderful folks who are donating $10 a month or more. So thank you very much. I want to say a special thank you to one of our Patreon supporters, Carol Stewart. And now we're on next month. Next month's talk, totally different. We are going to be having Dr. Jen Gunter back. You may remember she was here back in July, I think it was, to talk about her book, The Vagina Bible. And next month, she's going to be talking about the Menopause Manifesto. And yeah, it's pretty great. She's wonderful. If you don't know who Jen Gunter is, check her out on Twitter. She's fabulous. It's going to be a lot of fun. So I encourage you to join us on Thursday, May 27, to talk about the Menopause Manifesto. And finally, I'm just going to leave this up here. If any of you feel compelled, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you, Michelle Nijhuis. And I look forward to seeing you all next month. Thanks for being here. Good night.